Welcome to the podcast summary of Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert and Sullivan didn't just write a string of hit comic operas, they built a whole way of doing musical comedy with absurd premises, airtight craft, and a house style strong enough to last well beyond them. What makes the story interesting is that the magic came from three forces at once: Gilbert's topsy-turvy satire, Sullivan's music, and Richard D'Oyly Carte's knack for turning talent into an institution. And like a lot of great partnerships, it worked brilliantly. Irritated everybody involved, and somehow changed the culture anyway. Gilbert's signature move was wonderfully simple. Start with a ridiculous premise, then follow it with absolute seriousness. So judges marry plaintiffs. Pirates turn out to be noblemen. Gondoliers inherit monarchies. And the joke keeps getting funnier, because nobody on stage seems to notice how insane the setup is. That deadpan logic is the whole mechanism. Instead of giving the audience a lecture about class, bureaucracy, or political authority, Gilbert flips the world upside down and lets the contradictions expose themselves. It meant he could go after very British targets without always naming them directly. Put the story in some fictional place, or in an exotic setting like the Mikado's Japan, and suddenly you can say quite a lot about England while technically not talking about England at all. Even the endings fit the method. Chaos usually gets resolved by some last-minute twist that feels both ridiculous and weirdly prepared. Like the story has been quietly laying track for a punchline all along. That mix of surreal premise, precise plotting, and very formal language became a durable template for British comedy. You can feel the afterlife of it everywhere once you know what you're listening for. It's tempting to treat Gilbert as the brain, and Sullivan as the composer for hire. But later assessments pushed back on that pretty hard, and for good reason. The balance was the point. Gilbert brought the tightly engineered libretti and the verbal wit. Sullivan brought melodies that could carry the absurdity, but also moments of real feeling. That second part matters. These shows weren't just clever machines. Sullivan could give them pathos, warmth, and lift, which kept the operas from becoming dry exercises in satire. At the same time, the very thing that made the partnership successful also made it tense. Sullivan increasingly felt comic opera boxed him in, that he had to simplify his music and keep returning to a familiar formula. Gilbert, meanwhile, believed in his method and defended it. After Princess Ida and Ruddigore, Sullivan was blunt enough to say he couldn't go on writing works of the same character forever. So underneath the elegant rhymes and catchy tunes, there was a real artistic argument about ambition, repetition, and who got to decide what counted as growth. Then there's Richard D'Oyly Carte, who tends to get less casual name recognition but was absolutely central. He didn't just present the operas. He built the Savoy Theatre in 1881. The first public building lit entirely by electric light, which sounds both glamorous and slightly like tempting fate. More importantly, he built a system. The D'Oyly Carte Opera Company could produce the shows, tour them, license them, and preserve them as a recognizable repertory. That institutional side matched Gilbert and Sullivan's own standards. Gilbert was famously strict about staging. Actors had to know the words exactly, hit the planned movements, and leave the improvised gag business at the door. Sullivan was just as firm musically. He wanted musical display to serve the whole piece, not turn the evening into a star showcase. After HMS Pinafore, they leaned into ensemble casting and recurring comic types instead of building each work around pre-existing celebrities. That helped create a company tradition, and performers like George Grossmith, Rutland Barrington, Richard Temple, and Jesse Bond could grow within it over time. In other words, they weren't just making hits. They were standardizing a style. And the hits were very real hits. HMS Pinafore ran 571 performances in London. The Pirates of Penzance ran 363. Patience ran 578. The Gondoliers ran 554. Then there's the Mikado, which went 672 performances, making it the longest-running Savoy opera and one of the most frequently performed works in musical theater history. Pirates has one of those great theater business side stories. It premiered in New York instead of London. because they were trying to secure American copyright. That strategy did not exactly save the day. The attempt failed, and the opera still spawned hundreds of unauthorized American productions and imitators. So even the copyright battle became part of the show's history. The Yeoman of the Guard marked a genuine shift. It ended seriously, and it gave Sullivan room for his most ambitious theater score, including a sonata-form overture. That points to the larger pressure inside the partnership. Sullivan wanted to pursue more serious music, and eventually the compromise was the gondoliers for the Savoy, while he also produced his grand opera Ivanhoe for Carte's new theater. The most famous rupture came in 1890 with what history remembers almost comically politely as the carpet quarrel. On the surface, it was about Savoy theater expenses. Gilbert thought Carte's accounts had serious errors in them, or possibly worse. Sullivan sided with Carte, and the disagreement ended up exposing a much deeper fight about trust, authority, and control over the whole enterprise. Gilbert withdrew his libretti, the partnership temporarily ended, and only later did mediation bring them back together for 2 final collaborations. It's one of those disputes where the mundane detail, in this case a carpet bill, turns out to be carrying years of accumulated strain. Theater history does love an argument that sounds trivial until you open the door. The remarkable thing is how thoroughly Gilbert and Sullivan outlived their own moment. They helped turn English comic opera into one of the building blocks of 20th century musical theater. Their sharp lyric meter, memorable melodies, ensemble writing, parody, and institutional satire fed into writers and composers from P.G. Wodehouse and Cole Porter to Ira Gershwin, Oscar Hammerstein II, and Andrew Lloyd Webber. Their reach also escaped the stage entirely. Phrases like, a short, sharp shock. What never? Well, hardly ever. And let the punishment fit the crime moved into everyday English, and even showed up in legal opinions and political speeches. And this wasn't just prestige influence. It was participatory culture. In 1914, nearly 200 British amateur troupes were performing Gilbert and Sullivan. A 1948 report estimated about 5,000 annual American performances, apparently more than Shakespeare was getting. That's a pretty good sign. The tradition wasn't surviving as a museum piece. People were actually doing it, singing it, staging it, adapting it, and passing it along. That flexibility helps explain the longevity. The operas have been translated, parodied, turned into films and ballets, and reworked through political satire, Yiddish productions, and all-black cast productions. Because their world is intentionally artificial and never quite tied to one exact present. Each generation can redirect the satire at its own institutions. The costumes may change, but bureaucracy keeps volunteering for the role. So the legacy here isn't just a handful of famous tunes or a few very quotable lines. It's a full comic grammar for musical storytelling, built out of nonsense so precise, it keeps making sense. And honestly, that may be the most Gilbert and Sullivan thing of all. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.